Hi, I'm Ruth Molman from the Farmington Hills Historic District Commission, and I'm here with Barbara Demody, and we're going to be discussing the home front during World War II, which is often ignored. Someone brought it to my attention, and I said, oh yes, and Barb has a marvelous memory of the things that she did as a little girl and how it completely changed her life. The whole lifestyle was altered when this war came along, and people participated in such things as women going into the factories to help out, and how the home life changed, and a lot of the responsibility was left to these children. Barb, you were only...
Well, I was 8 when we heard about the fateful day. I distinctly remember, it's just like any important day, you know, where were you when Kennedy was assassinated? Well, we were listening to the radio. It was a Sunday afternoon, and it was my cousin's birthday. So we were having a nice little family celebration that day, and I was 8 years old. I obviously didn't understand the enormity of what had happened, but from the looks on the faces of all the adults, I knew that it was something really bad. And from there, lots of things changed. Lots of things.
You have a picture here of yourself as a little girl. During the...
Now this, I'm a little bit younger than the 8 on this, probably about 5. This is, maybe we were coming out of the Depression at that time. And as I was mentioned to you earlier, when you went to the dime store, there were these little booths, and you would put in, I don't know how much money, maybe 10 cents, I'm not even sure. And you would hurry up, sit down, and do 5 different poses. Of course, the finger on the cheek was the big pose at the time. I don't know why, but it was. And then later, or a while later, you'd go back, and in a little slot, these pictures would come out. And you'd pass them around to your friends or your family. And it was kind of a fun thing to do. I don't know when they went out of fashion. Maybe they went their way with the dime store or the Polaroid pictures or whatever it was. But that's where that picture happened to come from.
And well, once this happened to you, all of us, life changed dramatically. Of course, the men went into the service, and on the home front, they actually had rationing of food and...
Oh, yes. We had to do our part, and we did our part in many, many ways. And one of the things was much of the food had to go for servicemen. Many of the supplies were cut, and we just went into, like Detroit, the Detroit area was the arsenal of democracy. We went into building airplanes and tanks and all that sort of thing. So we had ration books. And these ration books had little stamps in them. And whenever you went to buy certain items, particularly like shoes, various items of clothing, meat, particularly meat, we had those little red ones in here. I don't know if they fell out. And then we also even had tokens. This was sort of your change from your rationing. If you didn't spend the whole coupon on your meat purchase, then they would give you the little token and you could use that. These were worth 1 point each. I think that some of these other things were worth maybe like 5 points. Oh, there's the little red one. This, you can obviously we bought a lot more meat than we bought any other things, because you can see that the red ones were used.
In the shoes?
Shoes, yes. I don't know how often I got a pair of shoes, but my grandfather was a shoe maker. He actually did make shoes, but not too often. Most of the time he repaired shoes. And when he did, of course, he needed leather, he needed rubber. He had a hard time getting those supplies as well. And I'm not exactly sure how he got them, but it was very important to repair your shoes rather than go out and buy a new pair. We go to Walmart, Kmart, we go to all these stores and we get it, you know. Mm-hmm. Not so. Sugar. Now, I do have a little tie-in to Farmington right now with the sugar. That was rationed. And so there were things, housewives had recipes for sugarless cakes and all sorts of things. They improvised a great deal. But I can remember that my aunt loved to buy birthday cakes at Mrs. Maddox. And Mrs. Maddox at that time was down on 12th Street in Detroit. I remember she wanted to buy a birthday cake for somebody in the family. And she went to Mrs. Maddox, and the first thing Mrs. Maddox said to her, "You bring me the sugar, I will bake you the cake." Ooh. So you had to take one of your ration points, and I don't know what color that was. Maybe one of the green ones was a grocery type of item. And I remember my aunt taking her the bag of sugar so that we could have the birthday cake. And that was very special. Very special. You didn't get the butter and the eggs. You only got so many of those items. So you had to be very, very frugal. There were one egg cakes, eggless cakes. If you go back in the old recipe books, you'll find that. So now Mrs. Maddox is down there on Orchard Lake Road there in 10 Mile.
Yes.
And is run, I think, by granddaughters or somebody who is related to her.
They also rationed gasoline, I recall that, and that's when they started with the oleomargarine, wasn't it?
Right. That was a big event for the kids. This is how kids got involved. We loved to mix up the margarine. At that time, it was against the law to sell margarine that was yellow. It had to do with the dairy companies and that sort of thing. So they sold it in a little 1 pound white packet, and you got a little orange, either a powder or later, I think it was Parquet that came out with the plastic bag that had the little bubble in it. So you let this come to room temperature, you squeeze the little bubble, and then you just sat there and you kept kneading it until all the orange turned into yellow, and you had your margarine. Your butter.
Your butter, in the place of butter.
Yeah, so it wasn't until quite a bit later that we got the colored, pre-done at the distributors.
So it really affected everyday life, the war did.
Right.
And,
very much, very much. I pointed out on the back of this ration book, it says, if you don't need it, don't buy it. And so it did. I think that most of the people were very good at improvising because we had just kind of come out of the Depression at that time. So they were used to doing without or making do, so to speak. And so it wasn't really hard on us to think of different ways of saving or maybe doing without. Even the CCC camps from the Depression era provided us with our very first, very well-trained and disciplined soldiers, simply because these men had to live in a certain regimented way when they were in the camps. And so when they became soldiers, it was not easy, but it was a good transition. They went into that discipline very easily.
that was the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was men that needed jobs that went into the forests and did all sorts of wonderful things, some of which we still have today to appreciate.
Right. There's a nice museum and camp up near Hartwick Pines as you're going up to Houghton Lake. And you can stop in there and they will explain exactly what happened. And you see how the men lived very frugally, but then it was good for them because they did earn some money. Yeah. And they did a lot of good things for the areas.
Community. Mm-hmm. Now getting back to the wartime and the things that you did as a little girl, they had, war bonds. I think you were involved in
right, the war bonds.
The schools, they were involved.
We, later too, this still went on, but it was very important for us to take our 10 cents a week or whatever it was to buy stamps, which we would save up until we got, I think it was $18.75 would buy you $25 bond. And we kids did sell. And then I think I showed this is kind of a miniature with President Roosevelt on it, and had the amount. It was kind of like a little souvenir type of thing that you did receive. And then at some point I did receive this award for selling $200 in bonds, and now when I think about what $200 meant at that time, it was a lot of money. It's dated December 20th, 1944, so we still had a little ways to go in the war. And kids got involved. Even at the movies, they would show a little film clip, and some movie star like Jimmy Stewart or somebody would come on and do a little spiel. Then they would stop the movie. People would go out into the lobby and sign up to buy a bond or get information about it. So this was the way that the government earned the money to finance the war.
Now, you had a direct involvement because your mother volunteered to work, which was unusual for that day.
Right. My mother was Rosie the Riveter, and I think if you looked at her in her old age, you would have think, oh no, not that lady. No, she couldn't have helped with the war effort, but she very definitely did. And it's funny because the women had to wear slacks. Well, I remember when my mother went to apply for a job, and she was trying to talk some of her friends into going along with her. And one of the biggest objections was, my husband will never let me wear slacks and never let me go into a factory with all those men. Well, my mother and a few of her friends did go. They wore slacks. They tied up their hair in bandanas, very much like that little prototype that you see of Rosie the Riveter in the advertising. And they worked. And they worked all kinds of shifts. They worked on factory machines. She worked, this is a later magazine from a different date, but she did work for the Morris Chain Company. Well, they made chains and gears and all that sort of thing. Very, very important for airplanes, tanks, trucks, all kinds of different equipment. So yes, she did her war effort. And my dad also worked for Fisher Body. He worked in a little more precision type of things, making very precision type instruments for airplanes. And that was down on Brush, near the downtown Detroit at that time. And it was very important at that time too for my dad to have a good job and involved in the war effort, because my father was quite young. My parents were only 20 years older than I, so my father was 28, and he was A1 in the Army. And of course, he would have been drafted, and particularly as the war progressed, it was a possibility because I was an only child. So the ones who had fewer children were taken. Fortunately, he never did have to go. But he did serve his time as an air raid warden for the neighborhood. He did his part. And he took a streetcar to work so that my mother could drive the car and share the ride with other people. So they did their part that way.
Well, it was leaving you alone too as a very young child.
Yes, but we lived in a second-story flat in my grandmother's house, so my grandparents were always available. Mm-hmm. And my grandfather being the shoemaker, he worked at home. He had his little shop at the back of the house. We lived on 32nd Street in Detroit, which is like easy to tell you, it's 32 blocks from downtown. Mm-hmm. So it was about 3 miles from downtown Detroit. And so I always did have somebody around, my grandparents. I learned to iron a shirt when I was 8 years old. I mean, I learned to clean house. To this day, I hate to clean house. I just hate it. But Grandma insisted, so yes, I did my part that way, aside from a few other things at school, selling bonds. We mentioned the paper troopers. We did get maybe like a half day off school. We'd bring our wagons or whatever we had, go around the neighborhood and pick up scrap paper, used paper, newspapers, that sort of thing, and deliver them. And so they gave us awards. We were called paper troopers, and we had certificates. They made the children feel very, very important, which we were. And then we helped collect the scrap metal, and they would have scrap metal drives once in a while. You'd put it out at the curbside, and trucks would come, just like our recycling does today.
With the paper, that's the first time they started to recycle paper.
I think so, yes.
And they recycled the metal. And also the grease, the cooking grease, that I wonder what they use that for.
I don't know. They used to say something about using it for bullets or something. In lubricating things. And then later I heard from somebody, it was just the busy work. Well, I don't know, but we did save it. You would have a little paper filter you could pick up at the butcher shop. You washed out a coffee can, and we filtered it. For example, if you cooked something like bacon or a piece of meat that had some grease, and you ran it through the filter so it took all the little particles off, you would take it back to the butcher shop when your can was filled, and he would weigh it, probably give you a penny or two a pound. I mean, let's face it, money did not mean exactly what it means today. But it was, again, the housewife doing her part by saving the grease.
I think you got a ration coupon, didn't you, for that?
You might have. They gave you awards. There were different things that you could do. And every little bit helped. It was kind of funny. Even soap, of course, because soap had glycerin in it, so you had to be very careful about how you used soap and how much you used. I think maybe that comes from the idea of taking your bar soap and unwrapping it now, letting it get harder so it lasts longer. So that might well be a part of what we were doing, so that it would save.
So this really, it completely changed American life. Completely. The women going to work and the involvement in the war. Let's see, I think it was because of the tires that they had gasoline rationing.
That, yes, and of course the gasoline itself was going to the military. I think one thing that was interesting when you mentioned women going to work, it really did change our pattern and what we have today with the working woman. What I found interesting is I remember when the war ended, my mother came home with a certificate, much like a high school diploma or college diploma. And it came from the company and the government, and it said, "Thank you very much for helping with the war effort, and you can go home now and be with your family, your husband and your children." Well, that lasted maybe a couple of months, and then my mother was called back to work. Why? All these soldiers were coming back. Yes, but all these soldiers coming back were buying homes. Everyone needed a new car. Everyone needed a new washing machine. Everyone needed everything. And so my mother went back to work and worked until I was in college. That helped to pay for my college.
Well, it's a very, very interesting thing to hear about what was going on in the home front. We forget about that and forget how involved we were. And it's really great that you had such wonderful memory of what was involved here.
Oh,
in
yes.
This. And you went on to college, and then you traveled overseas?
Oh, yes. Well, my husband was a great traveler. He loved to travel. And so consequently, we did a great deal of traveling. We did go also just not only overseas, but we virtually went to every single state in the Union. I never got to Alaska, my husband did. But other than that, we were in every single state, enjoyed traveling mostly by car. And I think the longest, I recall this one very well, the longest trip was 8,000 miles. It was a long trip. It took us through the West. He did like Canada. His mother was Canadian, became an American citizen when she married, but we also traveled a great deal through Canada, Europe, and we did meet in Europe too. So when we originally met, so that was kind of maybe the big push for us to travel.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, and really appreciate this.
Well, great, great. There are a lot more stories to tell, and someday maybe we can get together again and tell a few more.
Very good.
Good.
Thank you.